This is Duke University.
Actually, I almost went to law school there, but I had to go to Morgantown. It's like I can't. I had the snow. It was.
That is the one downside. It can get gray.
Yes, in the spring it comes late.
Right.
All right. Hello and welcome, everyone. Thank you for coming to today's Federalist Society debate on voter ID laws. I'd like to especially thank Professor Hu and the program in public law for helping us find Professor Atiba Ellis, a Duke Law grad and professor of election law at West Virginia University School of Law. Our guest today is Mr. Christian Adams. He writes for pjmedia.com. He has written a book called Injustice. I won't read the subtitle, it might make some of you angry. And then he also worked in the voting rights section of the Department of Justice. And with that, we're going to do a debate format with 15 minutes for Mr. Adams, 20 minutes for Professor Ellis, and then 5 minutes of rebuttal. And then we'll open it up to you guys for question and answer. Thank you again, and Mr. Adams.
Thank you. It's great to be here, and you can tell it's an election year by the crowd, or it's the Chick-fil-A. I'm not really sure which, but voter ID this year is going to be one of the biggest issues. And let me start by saying I don't know why, because in the end it's really not that big of a deal. Y'all can leave now, but let me explain my thesis about this. I think that voter ID in some regards is a base activation mechanism. The right loves it because it is a way to counter voter fraud, which they perceive to be prevalent. And the left loves it because it makes it very easy to claim there's racial motivation behind it. So each side gets all ginned up, and ultimately it might not really be that big of a deal. There's no empirical data on this, of course. So this is just a theory that I have that obviously everybody probably disagrees with. So let me get into the nuts and bolts of voter ID. What is voter ID? Well, all but 19 states have some mechanism at the polls that you have to show you are who you say you are. Many states it's a card, it doesn't have a photo on it, but more and more states, North Carolina, South Carolina, Virginia, are moving toward having photo voter ID. Photo voter ID, it has enormous public support. It has 80% support in the polls, 80%, and it has the majority of support among Democrats, Republicans, blacks, whites, Hispanics. Every demographic group, when they're polled, supports photo voter ID. So, of course, that doesn't end the question as to whether or not you should have it. Let me mention one thing. There is no express constitutional right to vote. Now let me clarify this. The Constitution does not have a fundamental right to vote in its language. It has the fundamental right to vote free from racial discrimination. That's the 15th Amendment. It has the fundamental right to vote for president if you're 18 years old. It has the fundamental right to vote free from gender discrimination. So there are parts of the Constitution which elevate review of election laws to a higher level of scrutiny. But generally speaking, and we could hash out the particulars, generally speaking, basic election regulations such as 30-day registration requirements, residency obligations, felon conviction disenfranchisement, voter identification, is subjected to a lower level of scrutiny. The Crawford case, Crawford versus Marion County, which was a 6-3 opinion, by the way, with Justice Stevens writing that the mere possibility of voter fraud, is adequate to justify a voter ID scheme. So it's not per se unconstitutional. You're stuck with a different statutory framework of analyzing voter ID, and that is the Voting Rights Act. Section 2 and Section 5, which I'm not going to get into unless it comes up, and we can talk about it in Q&A or later on. Okay. Challenges to voter ID in other states. Georgia. Plaintiffs in Georgia challenged voter ID in 2005 after it passed, and they couldn't even really find a plaintiff who had standing that couldn't get an ID. Because everybody here, I'm sure, has ID. There's no question in my mind. I'm not even going to ask for a show of hands, because every time I do, I see what happens. Everybody here has ID of some sort. The question becomes, what about that portion of society that doesn't have photo ID? What do you do with them? And the way Georgia solved this problem is they created a program to go out and get you free identifications, get you free photo ID. So they would even come to your house. And they're doing that something similar in South Carolina, where they show up to give you voter ID. So all of these laws that you're hearing about usually have safety valves, whether it's they come to your house to give you an ID, or if you don't have it on the day of election in South Carolina, you can execute an affidavit explaining why you don't have it, and you still get to vote. So there's a lot of safety valves in these statutes. It's not just you don't have ID, you're not allowed to vote. It doesn't work that way in reality. One of the biggest justifications used by voter ID opponents is that voter fraud doesn't exist or isn't very prevalent. I'm here to tell you that is false. I have proven voter fraud in federal court. There's the reported case that I would encourage all of you to read if you're really interested in elections. That's a case where voter fraud was so prevalent and so outrageous, it approached the level of lawlessness that you would not believe exists in the United States, with in-person impersonation, stuffing ballot boxes with bogus absentee votes, people giving their votes away. I mean, it's one story after another of forgery, perjury, and felonies. So I can tell you that voter fraud exists, but the biggest opponents of voter ID is a group called, one of the biggest opponents is a group called the Brennan Center for Justice out of NYU Law. And I tell this story because it relates to this case. They published a report called The Myth of Voter Fraud in 2007. And almost everywhere you go when you see opponents of voter ID, they're citing this report. They trot out how voter fraud is not very prevalent, it doesn't exist. And the Brennan Center for Justice is constantly providing an intellectual framework to oppose voter ID. Well, this report called The Myth of Voter Fraud was published in November of 2007. And would you believe it doesn't contain any mention of the 20 or 30 pages of court opinion that documented the voter fraud in that part of Mississippi? So here you have a report that's being used to tell you that voter fraud isn't very prevalent, and it entirely ignores one of the biggest voter fraud cases that was decided by a federal court in the last 10 years. That's the problem with the people who are opposing voter ID, is I don't believe they're always intellectually honest about it. Have any of you seen the New Hampshire videos from about 2 or 3 weeks ago, the New Hampshire primary? People took cameras and they went to polling places and they gave false names and they were given a ballot. Of course, New Hampshire doesn't have a photo ID requirement. I got an email earlier today in Minnesota. The same group today released a video of them registering to vote under the name of Tim Tebow and Tom Brady, false names to get voter registration in Minnesota. So the problem, what I'm telling you is voter fraud exists. This is the important point when you do the constitutional analysis. A state legislature does not have to establish that there is in-person voter fraud before they enact a voter ID law. That was what Justice Stevens said at 6-3 opinion in Crawford versus Marion County. So some of the arguments you hear against voter ID, such as there's no proven in-person voter fraud, those are nice, but they're not legally relevant. They're relevant to the policy questions. Let me close on the last argument, and I'm sure we'll probably talk more about this because it's the most hypercharged one. Many voter ID opponents claim that it is racially discriminatory, okay? An incredibly important, or I should say, powerful argument if true. Now, I've written repeatedly that there is a there is a sort of intellectual laziness to this, to ascribing racial motives to voter ID proponents. I've worked on voter ID legislation in multiple states, and I can tell you, nobody sits around and saying, how do we disenfranchise groups of people? That isn't the objective of these people. That isn't what's in their heart. What's in their heart is they want to bring integrity to the election process. They want to prevent in-person voter fraud. It would be like saying that people who support entitlement programs really intended to suck the life out of large segments of the community in America and create a dependency class. I mean, nobody says that about people who support entitlement programs, even though that's exactly what some argue would happen. Nobody says that abortion advocates at Planned Parenthood got involved in the issue of abortion and birth control because they wanted to decrease the population of African Americans in the country, so they focused on ensuring abortion and contraception largely in the African American community. Of course, anybody who knows anything about Planned Parenthood knows that's exactly what happened. That Margaret Sanger formed what she called the Negro Project. And that was her words, by the way, not mine. And she set out to sterilize large segments of the black community and prevent them from, quote, breeding like weeds, again, her words, and to eliminate, quote, defectives, delinquents, and dependents, again, her words. So my point of bringing up this history is that there are some things that were indeed racially motivated. But voter ID, I don't believe, is one of them. And so we can talk more about the particulars of statistical disparities. In South Carolina, for example, there was an objection on Section 5, under Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, to South Carolina's voter ID. And the statistical disparity between blacks and whites who did not have voter ID was 1.6%. 90% of African Americans had photo identification, and 91.4% of whites had photo identification. This 91.6% of whites. So I went to law school, I didn't do very good at math. This 1.6 statistical disparity became the basis of the South Carolina voter ID objection. And my question, which we can talk more about perhaps in rebuttal, is what is a sufficient disparity to justify, first of all, a Section 5 objection under the Voting Rights Act, but more importantly, a Section 2 claim, an affirmative case brought by plaintiffs to attack voter ID. Is a 1.6 disparity adequate to prove racial discrimination in light of the mitigating things that I told you about, including free IDs, they come to your house, and so forth? Let me close on this last thought. If you think about the arguments against voter ID, it's essentially saying that we should not make an effort to bring these folks who don't know photo identification into the mainstream of American life. If you don't have photo identification, think about what you cannot do, what you cannot participate in. Now, I understand some guy in a cabin in Montana wanting to get completely off the grid. But these are people, these victims of voter ID are not people who want to get off the grid. These are people who want to be part of the American experience. What can we do to encourage them to become more ingrained in the American experience? It's my theory that telling them that they don't, using them as an example to block photo ID is the worst thing you could do to these people, because there's finally going to be an opportunity for them to get free photo ID to become more ingrained in the American life. And so I'll close on that as my last reason to support photo ID. Thank you very much.
Well, good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be back home, and it's a pleasure and an honor to have been asked by the Federalist Society to give the counter view on voter ID law. I want to thank Professor Hu and Mr. Albert for the invitation. So I want to start by pointing out that Mr. Adams is right, that this field is rife with anecdotes that tend to give you a lot of heat and a lot of light, but they also tend not to focus in on the core issue here. And that these anecdotes seem to point to this notion that there is a question of election integrity out there. And though there is some instances, some reported, I'll grant that, of voter fraud, the question should be framed more in terms of what do we look at in the aggregate? In the absence of hard empirical data, and there are lots of scholars working on the data question right now, and I haven't seen a satisfactory answer to it myself yet. What do we need to think about in terms of the risks imposed by implementing voter ID only regimes, which is what I take Mr. Adams is advocating for. And by that, I want to point out just up front that we're looking at a shift in the law from having your driver's license being one of many ways to prove your identity, and that there are lots of laws, including the laws I assume Mr. Adams litigated under in federal court, which are used to capture this voter fraud problem, to a regime where we're looking at just the voter ID, just the driver's license, just the material that you can present on your card. And yes, we all have it in the room. I grant you that. But let me tell you a different story. Let me tell you about my grandmother. And in fact, I refer to her as my mom because she's the woman who raised me. In April, she's going to turn 90. She's on a fixed income. She stopped driving nearly 8 years ago, and her driver's license expired 5 years ago. Now, to fit within this regime, and what Mr. Adams didn't talk about, was the fact that even if the government shows up and says, here's this paper, sign them, what my mom would have to produce at that point is her birth certificate. This is under North Carolina law. She would have to produce her birth certificate, a letter for her utilities, which proves her residency, something from the Social Security Administration, and her unexpired driver's license. Now, under North Carolina law, that license has to have been less than a year expired. She stopped driving, and her license has been expired for nearly 5 years. So that doesn't even count. It knocks her out right at the box. The other problem is that birth certificate issue. She's 90. Folks who have been alive that long have serious problems. Sometimes the state doesn't even have them. She doesn't know where it is. And it would require a lot of time and money, $50 or more, for someone on a fixed income to obtain her birth certificate. Those are the steps that all folks have to go through in order to obtain that ID. So the fact that it's free and the fact that they may come to your house only indicates that there is not a direct cost. And in fact, the cost of coming to the house and setting up this scheme actually ends up getting held by the state. It has to be paid for out of yours, Adams's, my tax dollars. And so this raises two concerns about voter ID. One, that there is a huge cost here, and that governments strapped for money have to think about this cost. And in relation to folks like me who would argue that there is very little voter fraud out there of the form of in-person, at the ballot box, impersonation, the only fraud that voter ID laws can actually address, the cost, it far outstrips the benefit that is argued. But there's a deeper issue here, that my mom and other elderly people, the young, the poor generally, all of us have the right to vote. And the right to vote may not be explicitly mentioned in the Constitution and only in negative form, but it is a right that does have content. And it is a right that has been articulated in many Supreme Court cases and its parameters drawn out, including one called Harper v. Virginia. And if that right belongs to all of us, then we have a claim against the government to ensure that that right is exercised. And so the government, who is a partner here, has to undertake that right too. But to be fair, the government does have an interest in administering that right efficiently and effectively. And given this, the question becomes, how much of a burden can the government place on us, and not just the 90% of us who have ID, or the 80% of us who like the ID because they probably have it in their pocket, but the 10, 11, or 11% of us who don't. The issue is about thinking from their point of view and thinking about all those indirect costs that I just outlined, thinking about whether those burdens are sufficient in comparison to the fact that the right to vote is a right. And when I say 10, 11% of Americans, I'm talking 21 million people. And yes, that is according to the Brennan Center, I will admit right up front. So the question is voter ID law worth the cost to the 11% of people who don't have it and who may very well not be able to afford it? In other words, is voter ID worth the risk of structurally disenfranchising a tenth of voting age Americans? Obviously, my argument to that is that it is not worth the cost. That we have many schemes that include voter ID, but voter ID is not the exclusive approach in order to prove your identity at the point when you cast the vote. And again, that's what this issue is. It's about at the point when you get to cast your vote. So when we think about this, and when we think about the right to vote as a right, then the answer is no. This voter ID only scheme is not the best approach. So my argument to you then has to talk about what the right to vote is and why this risk is too high under the constitutional analysis, and why, even setting that aside, this may very well cost too much money. And this may very well end up being a substantial level of government regulation on the right to vote. And I presume that everyone in this room would be skeptical of heavy government regulation that may very well not be necessary. So it's a constitutional argument and a policy argument to encourage us to be skeptical about voter ID law. First, the constitutional argument. So yes, the right to vote isn't explicitly named in the Constitution. And in fact, the founders assumed that states would carry out the right to vote, and that the federal Constitution contains within it negative commands about how to carry out the right to vote. You can't discriminate on the basis of race or sex or age beyond the age of 18. So the content also comes from the Voting Rights Act, as Mr. Adams mentioned, and our interpretations of the Constitution as stated by the courts. The courts have time and time again talked about the right to vote as a fundamental right, as a right preservative of all other rights. In fact, it is the right that makes us all equal as citizens. And so as a right, it is something that each of us as citizens can exercise as the right holder. And we hold a claim against the state to exercise that right. The state cannot exclude us per se, or create barriers effectively removing us from the ballot. time and time again, when you look at the jurisprudence concerning the right to vote, those are the cases that you see. The state creating barriers that intent set aside create burdens so high that certain classes of people cannot reach them. And so this is why we have a Voting Rights Act. This is why we've had cases like Reynolds and Harper and Crawford even. The court is addressing that question. And so, given the nature of this right, what I'm arguing is that it carries a duty to the government to carry out their part in allowing us the right to vote. And thus, the government is obligated to ensure that elections are free, open, and fair, and free from fraud, to allow voters access to the right, because this is the heart of democracy. And so given that, there's also a practical issue. The government has to administer this. It would be too costly to go to everybody's house and to let them cast a vote right there. So, but on the other hand, holding elections for, say, 5 minutes might be too much of a denial. So the government has to strike a balance. And so the question about voter ID is, does the burdens that it creates strike the appropriate balance? Because any burden beyond what is minimally necessary is too much of a burden. And in fact, in the current test, in two cases called Anderson and Burdick, the Supreme Court has recognized this. So, given that, let me suggest a thought experiment for a moment. How many of you go to basketball games, Duke basketball? So, you had to camp out, right, in order to get tickets. Now, assume with me for a second that you had to go across campus to the Allen building to get a permit to then go camp out to get tickets. You would see that as a bit of an added burden, right? An added cost. Now, let me pose to you a choice. You either have to go stand in line all day behind 6,000 undergraduates to go get the camping permit, or you could pay $10 at the law school today and be done with that and go straight to the lottery. Which would you choose? You probably would just pay the $10 and go on and do it, right? So, we can see that creating layers of proof can create an added burden. So instead of basketball and camping, let's think about the right to vote and the nature of getting ID. For most of us, we have the ID. I used mine last night to board the plane. I also use it when I go vote. So most of us meet that. But for that 10%, for those millions of people, 21 million people, they're here. They don't have the economic wherewithal to get the ID, and to ask them to execute that burden would be forcing them to go from here to here. That's the issue when we're talking voter ID. So given that, is the state's interest in voter fraud and preventing voter fraud enough to outweigh that burden? That's the core question here. And when we look at the question of is there voter fraud, 494 F sub 2nd 440 notwithstanding, when we look on the aggregate, there seems to be very little out there. And in fact, the fraud that we're talking about is fraud related to things other than in-person voter impersonation. And so that raises the question of whether this is merely just a solution looking for a problem. Now, given that, an argument that you can agree with me or not agree with me with, let me raise a second question. Even if we undertake this, How much is it going to cost us, the taxpayers? How much is it going to cost the states out there facing the recession that seems not to be able to end? How much would that cost? Now, according to different studies, we are looking at, for example, in Missouri, $6 million in the first year, $4 million thereafter to administrate this. Indiana, $1.3 million to implement, coupled with a $2.2 million loss of income to the state. Estimates about North Carolina ranging from 18 to 25 million to implement this scheme, because this scheme would require people to presumably go to where voters may be and give them the opportunity for the ID. It would require education. It would require rewriting how elections are administered. And given all those factors, you can see the cost adding up. Now, $25 million in the scheme of $1 billion government like North Carolina may not be very much, but $25 million in relation to a near $1 billion shortfall suddenly becomes a lot of money. In relation to doubling how much elections cost in a state like North Carolina, that suddenly becomes a lot of money. And so when you read that against the problem that may not be there to be solved, then we have to wonder as a policy matter whether this is an appropriate allocation of funds. And it doesn't even address my original problem, which is that the documents still have to be obtained, which creates a cost. And so to even make birth certificates free, to even do all the work to get my mom's birth certificate, which may or may not be around there, or to provide some other alternative means, simply adds to the cost as well. So if you don't agree with my legal analysis, think about this policy analysis. Think about whether, given the potential of exclusion, or given the cost that we would have to put towards remedying that problem, whether that this is worth the money. A solution looking for a problem and costing us, the taxpayers, a large amount of money. And given that, what it sounds like is added governmental regulation making more difficult for some the right to vote to be exercised. And as a matter of thinking about a right, one has to be skeptical when we hear advocacy for more regulation. Regulation that might be efficient for us, but costly for others. And really costly for us, since it's all of us who have to pay the taxes to make this happen. So at the end of the day, from my point of view, the reasons for shifting to a stringent voter ID only system don't add up. In a world where our Constitution and our court has said the ability to pay does not relate to the right to vote, in a world where we are always skeptical about overreaching government interference, in a world where many people have said this is purely partisan, we have to wonder whether we should shift to a stringent voter ID system. Thank you.
I fear I'm losing my voice, so I'll try to be quick. Fingerprints. Here's an idea. Get rid of voter ID and just have everybody give their thumbprint when they vote. I think that would be one way to catch or at least preserve the real identity of the potential criminals. But I would submit that if this were proposed in the legislature, we'd hear all sorts of arguments against this too, which goes to one of my theses in my book, that there is a whole industry devoted to attacking any election integrity mechanism that comes down the pike. And so, old people. In many states, old people are exempted from the voter ID requirement, Missouri being one. If you were born before 1941, you don't have to have voter ID. And that same solution can be used to deal with the indirect costs that we heard about. On the question of indirect costs, there's always indirect costs to voting. If you vote absentee, you have to lick a stamp. If it's raining, you have to find an umbrella to go vote. You have to drive to the polls. You have to leave the house. For some people, that's an indirect cost. So I don't think it's a very persuasive argument that opponents of voter ID want to use to say that there's indirect costs related to voting, because all of us experience them. And so people will not be sympathetic to the idea that you have to incur some ancillary distraction in your life to participate in the election. Talking about costs, let's address that very briefly. In my book, I cite a poll by Democratic pollster Pat Caddell, who was Jimmy Carter's pollster. He did a poll, this is just a couple of months ago. He found that only 17% of the American public thinks that the government now has the consent of the governed. 17%. He characterized these results as pre-revolutionary. And this is a Democratic pollster. Ironically, when he polled the governing class, the elites, government officials, I dare say elected officials, the number was 55%. So you have this giant gap in this country between Americans who don't believe that the consent of the governed exists anymore and people who are oblivious to this view. A large number of people don't think elections are free and fair, and they don't think they're being done with integrity. So I'm not terribly sympathetic to the idea that it might cost extra money to infuse a measure of integrity into the electoral process, because people don't believe that elections are mechanically sound. It is a very difficult position for voter ID opponents to argue that the government cannot afford to encourage election integrity given the amount of waste that's in state and federal government. You need to prioritize, is the response to that. Lastly, let me close with the right to vote. And we didn't get a chance to talk about the court precedents here as much as I would have necessarily liked. But you heard about the Burdick case. It is not accurate to say that any voter regulation has to be that which is minimally necessary to achieve the end. That's a strict scrutiny analysis, close to it. The Burdick case, it's a Hawaii case, said that basic election mechanisms, registration itself, 30-day advance registration, which some states don't have, by the way. Minnesota, you can walk in on the day of the election and vote. Same with Wisconsin, Iowa. But the whole notion that you have to go to an office and register or take some affirmative steps to register to vote is a burden on voting. But the courts have ruled that these sort of non-discriminatory burdens do not undergo strict scrutiny, are not subjected to the absolute minimum tests. The question is whether they present an undue burden. Undue, sort of in the eye of the beholder. And the right to vote outside of the constitutional restraints of race, gender, and age in presidential elections are subjected largely to the lower level of scrutiny, the Burdick test that you heard about. So the question becomes that you all have to decide is whether something that the vast majority of Americans have, at least 90% in South Carolina, constitutes an undue burden to most people. And I would submit that there's ways to reduce the burden, making it free, not requiring a birth certificate necessarily for everybody. Older people, for example. People born to midwives. That's a big problem in a lot of places. Older generations had a large amount of midwifery, I think that's the right word, that were involved in births. So there's ways around these problems. And what I would like to see, because I'd be curious, is once you solve these ancillary problems, these peripheral problems about absence of birth certificates, old people, and so forth, will the opponents still oppose? And I'm afraid that many of them will, because they are more against mechanisms to ensure our elections are run legally without criminal behavior than they are to solving these problems. Now, I'm not saying that's everybody, but I've seen it firsthand. That isn't the only case of voter fraud. There's plenty of it out there. And so the question becomes, can governments take steps to prophylactically address voter impersonation? And the Supreme Court of the United States clearly ruled 6-3, yes, they can. That's what North Carolina is doing. That's what South Carolina is doing. The question is, how do you do it right? How do you do it so it doesn't affect people's right to vote free from racial discrimination? And I think there's a way to achieve it. Thank you very much for your time and attention. I think we'll take questions.
Thank you both. Questions?
Can I start with the question?
Absolutely.
So, now that we're two folks just sitting at the table, first of all, I do want to clarify, just so that actually, no, I'm just going to ask my question. You ended your remarks by saying there's plenty of voter fraud out there, which I guess I want a little more detail. When you say plenty of voter fraud, is it in-person voter impersonation fraud? And when you say plenty, I guess my question is just how much?
Well, how much voter fraud is okay? Let me turn the question. Is 1 unit of voter fraud acceptable? Is 20 units? Is 100 units? At what point I've used 0 units as the ideal situation. We want no voter fraud.
But here's the thing. When we're weighing, and the correct test is the character and magnitude of the injury to the right of the voter to vote versus the precise interest put forward by the state and in its justifications for the burden. I obviously was making a case for what the burden was, but what I don't hear when I hear advocates of pro-voter ID, when they say there's plenty of fraud out there, I want to know how many units, how many widgets are we talking about? So, because that's another place where I think the empirical data is lacking, because I would think you would agree that reported case law isn't necessarily the beginning or end of the counting.
Yeah. No, reported case law is an incredibly ineffective way to catalog voter fraud. Newspaper accounts are better than that. Convictions are good. Southwestern Virginia. I mean, look, I could literally spend 5 hours, if you gave me a week to prepare, going through one instance of voter fraud after another. I could do it for 2 days. There is so much voter fraud out there. Part of the problem is academics don't want to catalog it. I wish somebody would go out and catalog this in a honest way, unlike the Brennan Center, and show the pork rinds case in Southwestern Virginia, Terrell Campbell in East St. Louis and Granite City, Illinois, voting twice. I mean, I could literally go on and on. The man voting for his dead son in Oregon, using a false impersonation at the polls. There is case after case after case of voter fraud. But nobody in academia ever wants to quantify it, because as soon as they do, it gives a tailwind to the voter ID proponents.
Well, I'm an academic who's asking for the numbers, and on both sides, all we have are anecdotes, and I find that problematic, and I think that counsels caution here.
Well, do you need a research assistant?
Are you offering?
Maybe not me. I'm busy running this thing.
Well, let me just briefly mention, one of the most dangerous things is when you have the Brennan Center that most people who oppose voter ID turn to on the question of quantifying voter fraud, and it's not that big of a deal. They ignore all these instances of convictions, of guilty pleas that I talk about in my book, Injustice. They absolutely ignore it and act as if it doesn't appear. So how can you take them seriously when they say there isn't that much voter fraud?
Student questions, I think.
So it seems like you're making a cost comparison between sort of the voters that might be disenfranchised versus the cost of this program. But really, shouldn't you be making that same comparison between the cost, the fraud that is occurring, and the cost that we're currently using in terms of the legal system of preventing that fraud versus the cost of the program. And I would argue that in that like the current measures of preventing fraud, as in finding people who are fraudulently voting and then prosecuting them for it, is probably cheaper than it would be to administer this type of voter ID program.
Your question was directed to me. You sound like
yeah.
you're doing a law and economics analysis here. Look, I would submit that people can place a value on having an election system that they believe is free of integrity. A legislature can do this, even without empirical data, and that's what Justice Stevens said in Crawford, that they can simply make a decision legislatively to say we're going to enact a statute that stops something that might not even be happening. That's literally in the Crawford opinion, that they don't need any justification to enact a voter ID law.
Well, but I'm not saying that they don't have the right to do so. I'm just questioning whether it's a good idea from a policy standpoint. I mean, if we're going to be spending more money on administrating the program than we are spending on, the justice system, like every time someone reads about the fraud that happens in the newspaper, that's going to create a general deterrence effect of another person who's thinking, maybe I'll do fraud, but then I just read about this happening, so maybe I'm not going to do it.
See, I think it's exactly the opposite. When you read the cases and the accounts of voter fraud, it exposes the weaknesses in the system. And I think it actually encourages people to do more of the same. Terrell Campbell, the guy I talked about who voted twice in the last presidential election, when people learn you can register in more than one state, and you read it in the newspaper, even though there's a conviction, I think the criminal mind, of which I suspect you don't have, begins to think of ways to game the system and say, wow, I never knew I could do that. And I think it's exactly the opposite. So.
Well, it would seem, though, that preventing the notion of people getting it to register in more than one state, which I think the Help America Vote Act also creates a mechanism to create systematic purges of voters who don't come and elect, is a solution short of instituting voter ID law. So in essence, it's the difference between what I take the question to be tweaking the system and making its working mechanisms work more effectively than radically implementing a whole new system.
Stu?
I would think the burden would be more on the parties who are proponents of the voter ID system to show, what are we talking about? How much voter fraud is there? Is it 10% of an election? Because you're talking about 10% of people not having the ability to vote under this new law, and is the fraud that you're supposed to be combating really rising to that same level?
Well, first of all, it's not 10% who would be unable to vote under the new law. That's not accurate. There's mechanisms that those 10% would still be able to vote if you're referring to South Carolina's law, which I suspect you are. So it's not accurate to say they won't be able to vote. But Justice Stevens addressed this, and the answer is no. The burden is not on the legislature.
I'm not speaking constitutionally. As a policy concern, shouldn't you be showing to the public just how much fraud you're preventing?
Your argument then goes against a whole slate of other election mechanisms, like residency requirements. That's an argument against pre-registration to participate in the election. That's an argument against all sorts of other election administration issues that you can take the same arguments. Well, why do we have any restrictions? We should, like, did everyone see the movie Idiocracy? Why not just sit at home with your remote with a tube in your mouth and vote? I mean, your argument goes against all of these other mechanisms that exist in the election administration. Now, to your question, I would submit to you that there is evidence. This was not a forum to talk and cataloged and advertised on campus as the catalog of voter fraud. I'm happy to come back next week, and I will do the catalog of voter fraud. And if you will attend, I think you'll be persuaded that it is a real problem, and the burden would be carried.
But you're still talking anecdotal evidence, not...
Well, I'm talking convictions. A conviction is not anecdotal. A man in prison is not anecdotal. A guilty plea and a felony conviction has more than anecdotal value. It's a real thing. And I would submit to you, one is enough. If you have in-person voter fraud like we had up here, that's enough. That's all you need.
But Mr. Adams, doesn't that raise another question, which is, if we're convicting people, don't the current laws work?
Well, Justice Stevens addressed that in Crawford, and and it's a great reading. I would suggest you read him, not listen to me. Merely having a conviction here and there does not mean that there's not people that are getting away with the same behavior.
Could I just make one other quick response to that, which is that Justice Stevens' opinion only garnered 3 votes. Just to clarify the votes in Crawford, the Stevens opinion took 3 votes, Scalia's opinion took 3 votes, and he would just simply say, this is reasonable, end of the story, which may very well support your point of view. And then there were 3 dissenters.
I don't think people were diverting or
So the court
diverting on the
itself is
question of,
disagreeing on how to apply the standard, which is my point.
I'm confident that on the point I just mentioned, that on the issue of just because you have only 1 or 2 convictions doesn't mean there's other criminal activity out there. I'm confident that that was not something that they fought over and split their votes over. I'm pretty sure that they would all be in agreement, all 6 of them.
You've had your hand up the whole time. Now we'll go to you, Jackson.
I mean, I would almost concede to you that if there was a voter ID statute that was only voter ID and that was the law, there would be a de minimis amount of in-person fraud. But what you've just articulated is that you yourself and the statutes are all open to having exceptions, to having other standards other than that. How can you argue on the one hand that the current system, which a voter ID is a major part of, but has these exceptions, it fails, and yet a system where there is a more stringent voter ID system, but there are still places where you might not need your birth certificate? How can that not be gamed in exactly the same way by these criminal minds?
No, that's a great point. I'll concede, and I will characterize my willingness to advocate for exceptions, like for old people, is a pure political concession to voter ID opponents. But so what? It's trying to make the law better. I mean, we suddenly aren't going to argue we want a law that doesn't work well. I mean, I think you have to make some concessions for the larger purpose of bringing election integrity. I don't think you have many 80-year-olds, despite the fact I mentioned one of them here who was voting for his dead son. I don't think you have as many 80-year-olds gaming the system. I mean, I don't have any empirical data.
But just to clarify, you said just one example was enough
Yeah.
to kind of...
No, it's inconsistent. I'll grant that. Okay, big deal.
Jackson?
I mean, one kind of issue that it seems like neither of you really addressed is kind of the political dimensions of this. I mean, it seems like from a lot of the evidence I've seen is that the anecdotal evidence and the statistical evidence shows that voter fraud has been pretty constant over the past few decades, and this huge rising tide of voter ID laws within the past 12 to 18 months, especially gearing up for this really big election. I mean, I was wondering, what are your opinions on kind of the political aspects of that?
Yeah, well, the opponents will say this is directed at Democrats, okay? The proponents will say, the Republican proponents will say, well, we just want a whole bunch of elections, so we get to make the rules now. Elections have consequences. Look, the Constitution does not create a protected class of political people. There's no part of the 15th Amendment that says race and or what party you're a member of. So you can go out there and win elections and skewer your opponent. That's just the reality of the political system.
Well, I think the Constitution also, well, put it this way. I think the root of the problem is that this is rooted in the political process, and that the gamesmanship that Mr. Adams just referred to is all over the law of democracy writ large, not just voter ID law,
right.
but you
Redistricting.
You can just think of the panoply of examples. My point of view is that, yes, maybe this is just another instance of partisan gamesmanship, which counsels for conceiving of this as a right belonging to the individual and then thinking through the burdens and the justifications from that point of view. Realizing, too, that things that are neutral probably pass muster, which the court has said, I will grant, but the question then becomes, does this issue amount to a burden that's de minimis or not.
Yeah, I mean, look at the alternative. I mean, I agree completely with what you just said. It shows up in redistricting, it shows up in voter ID. The solution in our system is to go win the next election, to create enough of an anger about voter ID that you take back the North Carolina House. The problem is, though, is most people agree with voter ID, so it's not going to work. What I'm saying is, look at the alternative. The alternative system is the system we left in England, where there was no political process, where kings got to decide these issues. And so we're in a better situation now, despite the horrors that you articulate, that I can certainly understand if you're on the receiving end are not comfortable. But this is a better system than the alternatives, and that is to have a legislative political process sort this out, even if it means there's victims.
We have time for one more, and I'm going to go with Nathan. Sorry, Corey.
I'm just wondering, how would you suggest getting the empirical data? I don't think people are going to just be like, yeah, I illegally voted.
Well, that's a good question. Okay. Look, you have to look at what you have available. And what you have available are criminal convictions, arrests, indictments, newspaper accounts, affidavits from time to time. That's the best data you have. Best evidence rule, kind of, to borrow from evidence. It's all you're going to have. You can't concoct anything better.
And that's the evidence in terms of getting fraud, or at least reported instances of fraud. To look at impact of voter ID, we're going to have to investigate very closely how many people in our society do not have it, have to figure out whether the alternative means would capture those folks, and to figure out whether or not they want to vote too. And then that gives us a number of exact amount of impact. And my argument is we need to do that weighing before making any change.
Before we thank our speakers, I want to plug a few events this week. We're having Judge Ed Carnes from the 11th Circuit come tomorrow for lunch. We'll be serving the pig, so you don't have to have Chick-fil-A 2 days in a row. I know that would be terrible. The pig is barbecue. He'll be speaking on Mr. Jefferson's Wall 210 years later, the metaphor Thomas Jefferson used in his letter to the Danbury Baptists and its implications on Establishment Clause jurisprudence. And then Friday morning, we are co-sponsoring with the Duke Journal of Constitutional Law and Public Policy their symposium featuring, our guy in the morning, Dr. Greva, and we're having a small group discussion with him at 8:30. Breakfast will be served at 9:30, and then his panel starts at 10:30, and that's on state debt. With that, join me in thanking our excellent speakers today.
Produced by Duke University. Online at duke.edu.